Our first keynote today will be given by Dr. Catherine Doldiorina, and she is an independent consultant at the International Institute of Space Law, the IISL. She's a space law expert and an independent consultant on matters related to intellectual property law and space activities. She worked as a researcher at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Italy, with a focus on policies and regulations regarding access to and use of geographic and Earth observation data. She was also the former chair of the Space Generation Advisory Council, and she's engaged in legal research related to space activities since 2005. Please join me in welcoming on stage Dr. Doldiorina.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very honored and happy to be here. And actually, if we could put the word cloud picture, I went through my notes yesterday of the first 2 days to look for some keywords that were mentioned by speakers during keynotes and the panels to gather some ideas and thoughts for this keynote and make it more relevant for all of you. And so it's up. So I compiled different phrases and words that I heard from various speakers during these 2 days. And as you can see, the mostly used phrase was to produce information, as well as to combine data and ensure data availability. And I think that is fitting extremely well with the topic of the keynote and the panel to follow. And I would like to focus on particularly legal and policy aspects of democratizing space data in the light of the necessity to produce information, to produce knowledge, and to combine data from different sources, including space data, in situ data, other types of factual data. And now I can go to my actual presentation. So I think everybody in the room should know that open data trend has been quite strong, appeared to be quite strong in the past, over the past 10 years or so, and it affects many areas and many types of data. In particular, the government produced or held data, and space data has been also included into this overall trend of opening access to data and opening and widening the possibilities to work with data, to analyze data, to produce different types of information, goods and services. And this trend of opening data has been happening, you could say, worldwide, and both on international and national level. Some of the speakers have, of course, mentioned related to space data, Landsat example and the Copernicus example, where data are really available without any restrictions to any user across the world. And quite a few other countries are also following the stance. One of the earlier examples that was also highlighted here is the CBERS satellite series of the China-Brazil Joint Earth Observation Satellite Project that also already early on within the development of the project committed to open availability of data to users in many parts of the world. And I think that this trend is really important in the light of the necessity to access data from various sources, from various missions, and to be able to work in an unrestricted way with data to produce products that really are necessary for a specific application or a specific activity. From the legal perspective, I just want to highlight a couple of areas that are relevant for using the data, including data from satellites and other types of spatial data. It's the copyright and intellectual property law. It is the public sector information laws and regulations, as well as personal data protection rules. These are just examples of what I think are the most relevant areas, but of course there are other areas of law that play a role in shaping the regime of accessing to and use of space data. Just to give you a very brief overview of what is the most important aspect of copyright regime when it applies to data, is that it covers or it protects the expression and not the content. And I think a lot of non-legal professionals, particularly those who work with data, they often either misunderstand or they simply don't realize that the data as such is not protected by copyright. It is only how the data are presented, so that the form of their presentation, that copyright can protect. So the content of the data that actually serves for analysis and for production of information or knowledge services and products is not protected by copyright. And I think it's important to emphasize this, particularly to those of you who need to work with data and do some analytical activities with the data available to you. And the protection criteria, the most important protection criterion is that of creativity, and the threshold of creativity for copyright protection is very low, so any type of intellectual effort, in fact, most often will result in production of a work worthy of copyright protection. It doesn't have to be innovative, for example, as a patent, as an invention. It just has to be different from the work that others have done. And another aspect of copyright protection that is important for data and for working with data is that there are always exceptions. So the rights of authors always are subject to exceptions that allow, in particular, use for research and education purposes of data without the need to pay and reimburse the author of the work. So there are always ways to access the data in a way that you would not infringe the rights of the author, even if you use these data, but you of course need to know the details and the legal framework that is applicable to a specific data set when you're practically accessing and using it. On the other side, and this is kind of the underpinning framework for the open data trend is the public sector information laws and regulations that deal with the regime of availability and use of government-produced or held information. And this trend is really has been very strong in the past 10 to 15 years, I would say. And many countries adopt national laws and regulations that release or mandate government institutions to release as much information and data as possible that is related to their work and mandate them to make them available in usable formats, often open formats, and make them available from central platforms, centralized platforms with easy access, etc., etc. And this also covers data that are produced or held by space agencies, for example. And one, as an example, is the Copernicus or Landsat, but lately, particularly in the last couple of years, also in Europe, there were passed several laws, for example, in Germany or France, that mandate all government institutions, including space agencies, because they are considered to be government institutions, to make public as much of the data and information they produce as possible on the open databases, which means that they can they have to grant rights to the user to handle the available data and information in the way they want, including for commercial purposes without any charges, additional charges. Some of the important aspects that I wanted to highlight from the legal perspective that relate to democratizing space data and enabling use of space data is that if you are granted just the access to data, it's quite meaningless. So just looking and being able to discover the data is not enough. It's not enough to produce information, it's not enough to start working with the data and combining data from different sources. So whenever you see that data are made discoverable, that's a very small step on behalf, for example, of a government to release their data. It's important that data are released with use rights. So use rights, by analogy with copyright, which is often used to define the rights in how data can be handled, are to adapt, to redistribute, to produce derivative works, and to distribute derivative works produced freely and without restrictions. License is the primary mechanism to handle the available data, and license will always tell the user what can be done with the data and what is prohibited. So knowing your license is a very important step when you want to combine data from different sources and produce information, products or services. The drawback of a license is that license is an ad hoc mechanism. It is something that is imposed by the owner of the data it can be for any individual data set. So to avoid the multiplicity of different licenses, a regulatory sharing and use regime is seen as a secure alternative because it provides a basis for a uniform regime for, let's say, a specific category of data and information or a specific area, and then the license that is applicable to that specific, to data from this specific area will be the same for any of the data sets that are covered by this regulatory regime. A very important aspect is that of interoperability. I'm sure that most of you know that interoperability on the technical level is very important, because if your data sets are not in, let's say, in compatible formats or written in different language, then it's hard to work with them. But there is also the aspect of legal interoperability, which means that the license and the use rights attached to the data have to be the same. So, for example, if I have a data set A that is, let's say, Copernicus data that is available without any restrictions, and I can modify the way that I want and reproduce or produce derivative works and distribute them for any purposes but for illegal activities. And then I have a data set B, and the license of that data set tells me that I cannot modify the data that I have access to. So if I combine my Copernicus dataset A with that other dataset B, the result is that I cannot distribute the derivative product that I made because the restrictions on dataset B deprive me of the freedom to handle the data and the analysis that I made, the results of the analysis that I made, as freely as I can. So this means that to ensure that you can work with data from different sources, you need the licenses to be compatible with each other. Otherwise, you will have troubles with any further use of the original data and data sets that you accessed. So this is an important aspect, particularly because we've been talking about this necessity and the importance for the future of combining data, of integrating data from different sources. So this aspect of legal interoperability is very important and has to be borne in mind in order to avoid difficulties with working with data in practice. One example that I wanted to briefly highlight in terms of success of democratizing space data is the effort of the group on Earth observations in establishing their GEOS platform. Early on in its existence, GEO has produced its data sharing principles, according to which the countries, the member states of GEO, were invited to share their data and set up the GEOS portal. And these principles underwent quite an important modification several years ago. And this is a busy slide, but this is the first lines are the principles that were initially adopted by GEO, and the second half of the slide are the principles that, the way they were modified. And a very important distinction is that GEO went from promoting open and unrestricted sharing to establishing the open and unrestricted sharing of data as a default mechanism for GEO members and participating organizations. And the old principles also encouraged unrestricted use for education and research and education purposes, while the new principles omit using this, let's say, limitation and proclaim that the open data sharing is the basis for any type of use, so not only for research and education, but also for commercial activities or any other legal types of uses of products and services made with the data access through geos. So I think it's a very good example of effort to open more data and to be really bold in the sense of trying to make as much open as possible and only reserve the restrictions on access and use to exceptional specific cases rather than going on the contrary and releasing just a little bit and then saying that there are too many restrictions and I have to refrain from making many data and information assets available. Just to briefly mention challenges to open space data, and these, I believe, are challenges to any type of data, not necessarily and only data that we get from space. It's interoperability, as I mentioned, both on the technical and legal side. The issues of privacy, consumer and data protection, especially that can come very often into play with integration of data and making interactive data applications. Security and cybersecurity can play quite an important restrictive role in handling space data openly. The issues related to big data, and I think what is relevant to our context here, being in Uruguay, is the capacity building. And I think that it's not only capacity building that enables actual work with the data, but I think making people aware of also the relevant legal framework is a challenge, but is something that is necessary to do in order to proceed with the progress of democratizing space data. To briefly conclude, I believe that the progress in the sphere of opening data and democratizing data, including space data, is there, and it's significant, and it's growing on many levels. The regulation is necessary to ensure that this process is successful, and I believe that if addressed in a smart way and even limited in terms of, let's say, regulatory intervention, even the differences among regimes in various countries will not impede unrestricted and free use of space data and their distribution. However, I would like to stress that it is impossible and maybe also unnecessary to eliminate all restrictions on access and use, because there are different situations, particularly when we talk about security, when we talk about issues that are sensitive to specific situation and something that has to be kept restricted. This needs to be done, and it cannot be, a claim cannot be made that everything has to be made openly, because it will create maybe more chaos than progress in certain areas. And I believe that some restrictions are indeed necessary in order to protect specific interests, but they do not necessarily impede too much the benefits from open and unrestricted ability to use space data. And this concludes my presentation for today. If there are any questions. And we also had, yes, a poll question with the word cloud, and I can see that we have as the key aspect of democratizing space data access as the most important thing. Just to emphasize once again, it's not just access. It's access that is underpinned by the rights to use what you access. If you don't have the rights to use the data and information that is made available, then just access by itself is not giving you anything. Thank you.